I never thought my quiet retirement would turn into the fight of a lifetime. One morning, a thick envelope landed in my mailbox with a demand so outrageous it nearly stopped my heart, a $250,000 fine from the HOA, accusing me of trespassing on land I had lived on for over 3 decades. They said my fence, my shed, even the garden my late wife once tended were all illegal. But here's the twist: the same people threatening to bankrupt me had been living large on my property for years without even knowing it. Pools, garages, luxury wings, all built on land my father left me. They tried to crush me with lawyers and intimidation, but what I uncovered next didn't just save my home, it put their entire empire in jeopardy. The morning it all began felt as ordinary as any other. I was sipping coffee on my porch, listening to the faint crow of my rooster, when the familiar sound of the mail truck rumbled down the street. After 30 years in this house, I knew that routine by heart. Mail at 9:15 sharp, usually nothing more dramatic than utility bills and the occasional flyer for some overpriced landscaping service. But that morning, when I pulled a thick, heavy envelope from the mailbox, the air seemed to shift. The gold-stamped return address read Silver Creek Estates, Homeowners Association. My gut tightened. I hadn't had much to do with the HOA, never needed to. I'd kept to myself, tended my garden, fixed up my fence, and lived a life as quiet as the surrounding hills. Yet something about the expensive lettering on that envelope screamed trouble. I stood in the driveway, the late morning sun beating down, and tore it open. The words on the first page made my blood run cold. Violation notice. Fine of $250,000. My jaw went slack. The letter accused me of 3 violations: illegal fence placement, unauthorized structures, and encroachment on HOA green space. My fence. It had been standing in the same place for 3 decades, hammered into the ground by my own father, back when this neighborhood was nothing but dirt roads and farm plots. Unauthorized structures. They were talking about my tool shed, my chicken coop, and the gazebo where my late wife, Margaret, used to read every evening, and the so-called encroachment. That was my vegetable garden, where I had grown tomatoes for longer than most of these mansion dwellers had even lived in this state. The fine wasn't just outrageous, it was absurd. $250,000 for existing on my own land. My hands shook as I read on. The notice stated that if I didn't remove the violations within 30 days, the HOA would pursue legal action, liens, and possibly forced sale. They were threatening to take everything I had worked for, everything my father had left me. Just then, Martha Lee, my neighbor across the street, waved from her lawn. She was watering her hydrangeas, blissfully unaware of the bombshell I was holding. "Good morning, George," she called cheerfully. "Mail, bringing you good news." I forced a smile and raised the envelope, too numb to answer properly. If only she knew. Before I had time to sit and catch my breath, I heard the sharp click of high heels against gravel. Looking up, I saw her, Victoria Langford, president of the Silver Creek HOA. She was the kind of woman you could smell trouble on from a mile away. Designer sunglasses, a clipboard clutched like a weapon, and the posture of someone who had never been told no in her life. 2 other board members followed behind her, whispering like sycophants attending their queen. "Mr. Miller," she announced, not even bothering with a greeting. Her tone was clipped, rehearsed, dripping with disdain. "We've documented several major violations on your property, and I'm here to confirm them before we proceed with legal action." She strutted across my yard as though she owned it, pointing to my fence, my garden, my shed, and scribbling on her clipboard. Every word out of her mouth was like gasoline on a growing fire in my chest. This fence crosses into HOA land. That shed violates setback codes. This garden encroaches on green space reserved for the community. I tried to keep calm, but my patience snapped when she dismissed my protests. "Mrs. Langford," I said firmly, pulling out my original property deed from 1971, a document I kept in a fireproof safe for decades. "My boundaries are right here in black and white. That fence has stood in the same place since my father put it in." She didn't even glance at the papers. With a flick of her manicured hand, she said, "Irrelevant. Those documents are outdated. We have a modern survey from 2012 that shows otherwise. You're trespassing, Mr. Miller, whether you realize it or not." I felt my face flush with anger. The arrogance in her voice was enough to make a man's blood boil. Fortunately, Martha had crossed the street by then. She placed her hands on her hips and said, "Excuse me, but I've lived here for 25 years, and that fence has never moved an inch. I'd know I've looked at it from my kitchen window every morning since I moved in." Victoria didn't falter. She smiled coldly, the kind of smile wolves give before they bite. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Mrs. Lee. The updated lines don't lie. This isn't personal, it's procedure. Procedure." That word echoed in my head like a curse. To her, this wasn't my life, my land, my memories. It was paperwork, something to be swept aside with the stroke of a pen. She threatened legal action again, then turned on her heel and marched off, her heels crunching against my gravel like nails on a coffin lid. I stood frozen, fists clenched, staring at the dust she left behind. My home wasn't just a house. It was where I raised my children, where my wife's laughter once filled the evenings, where every fence post and garden row carried decades of sweat and history. And now, these people, these million-dollar homeowners with their manicured lawns and imported cars, thought they could scare me into surrender. But I wasn't about to roll over. I'd spent 45 years in construction, studying blueprints, managing sites, and understanding boundaries better than most surveyors. If they wanted a fight, they had chosen the wrong old man. That night, I couldn't sleep. The violation notice sat on my kitchen table, illuminated by the dim glow of the lamp, taunting me. My father's words echoed in my mind. "Land is the one thing they can't make more of. Son, guard it with your life." So that's what I decided to do. Guard it. With every tool, every ounce of knowledge, and every drop of stubbornness I had left in me. They thought they could intimidate me with threats of lawsuits and money. But I knew something they didn't. Truth leaves a paper trail. And if my gut was right, theirs wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. I poured myself another cup of coffee, pulled out my old surveying tools from the garage, and made a promise right then and there they weren't going to steal 1 square inch of my father's land, not while I still had breath in my body. The following morning, I woke with a determination I hadn't felt in years. The violation notice still sat on my table, mocking me with its gold-embossed header and threats written in neat legal jargon. I brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint, pulled my father's old deed from its folder, and studied the survey descriptions like a general reviewing a battle map. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. According to the HOA's letter, the boundaries had shifted in 2012, but why would a boundary survey be necessary decades after these homes were built? Property lines don't shift just because someone with money wants them to. Boundaries are recorded in county offices, protected by law, and enforced through deeds. My 1971 document wasn't just some outdated relic, it was legally binding. Yet Victoria Langford dismissed it as if it were yesterday's newspaper. I needed answers, and I knew exactly who to call. Daniel Brooks had been my closest friend back in the construction days, a lawyer who specialized in property disputes before retiring a few years earlier. He still kept an office downtown, mostly consulting on cases when younger attorneys needed a veteran's wisdom. When I told him about the fine and the so-called updated survey, he whistled low. "George," he said, leaning back in his chair, "this stinks. HOA fines usually run a few $100 for grass length or a mailbox color. 250 grand. That's a shakedown. And this survey they're waving around if it was done after development. It deserves a closer look. You need an independent surveyor, someone who can prove where your lines actually are. Do it fast before they push for court." His words stuck with me. I drove home with my mind racing, passing by the towering mansions that loomed over my modest property. Their infinity pools sparkled in the sun. Their stone facades glimmered like castles. And I couldn't help but notice how much of that luxury seemed awfully close to my land. That evening, I dug into my garage. Dust clung to the old cases as I pulled them open my surveying tools, untouched for years. A handheld GPS unit, metal stakes, measuring tapes, even a battered metal detector I once used on job sites. I felt a strange thrill in my chest. It had been a long time since I'd used these tools. But the knowledge hadn't left me. Boundaries were in my blood. I started with the obvious, my fence line. According to my father's deed, The northern boundary should line up with 3 iron stakes he set back in the 70s. Over time, they'd been buried by grass and soil, but I remembered where he'd hammered them in. Using the metal detector, I swept along the fence until I heard the sharp beep. Digging carefully with a spade, I struck metal. My heart pounded as I pulled up a rusted iron stake, exactly where it should be. I checked another spot, then another. Each time, the stakes matched the deed perfectly. My fence hadn't budged an inch, which meant one thing: the HOA's claim was wrong. Deliberately wrong. But as I expanded my search, I uncovered something that made my hands shake. The stakes didn't just confirm my fence's accuracy, they revealed that my land extended further than the current boundary showed. In fact, it overlapped with manicured lawns, fancy driveways, and, most alarmingly, the edge of Victoria's prized swimming pool. I stood there in the fading sunlight, staring across the street at her gleaming estate. The implications hit me like a thunderclap. If my findings were correct, the HOA wasn't fining me for trespassing. They were covering up the fact that they had been trespassing on me. The next day, Martha stopped by with a casserole. She'd seen me digging around with my tools and wanted to know what was going on. I explained, showing her the old deed, the stakes, and my GPS readings. She gasped, covering her mouth. "George, I remember when those houses went up. The crews were always out there moving markers, hammering things in at night. I thought it was strange, but I figured it was all legal." "You're telling me they built on your land?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," I said grimly. She sat at my kitchen table, eyes wide, her casserole untouched. "You have to fight this. Don't let them bully you. People need to know." Her encouragement meant more than I could admit. For years, Martha had been the kind of neighbor you could count on for sugar, small talk, or a sympathetic ear. Now, she was about to become my first witness. Still, I needed undeniable proof. My preliminary tools could only tell part of the story. For a battle this big, I required precision, the kind only a licensed surveyor with modern GPS equipment could provide. I spent that evening on the phone until I reached Jake Collins, a respected surveyor with 3 decades in the field. He was known in 3 counties as the man who could settle disputes that had dragged on for years. When I explained the situation, especially the suspicious 2012 survey, he grew quiet. "George," he said finally, "I've seen this before. Developers, HOAs, even city councils. Sometimes they pull stunts like this, banking on folks not having the time or resources to fight. But if your land extends the way you think it does, this isn't just a small mistake. This is fraud. Systematic fraud. I'll bring my equipment this week, and we'll get the truth." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me. For years, I'd believed my battles were behind me, my children grown, my wife gone, my days spent quietly tending tomatoes. But now I realized I was being pulled into something much bigger than myself. This wasn't just about a fence or a shed. It was about legacy, justice, and whether ordinary men like me still had a chance against money and power. I thought of my father again, of his calloused hands driving those stakes into the earth half a century ago. He'd always said land was sacred, not because of its value in dollars, but because it represented freedom, independence, stability for a family's future. That night, I made another promise to myself: I would see this fight through, no matter how ugly it became. The HOA thought they could bury me with fines and intimidation. What they didn't realize was that they had awakened something they weren't prepared for: an old man with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. And as dawn broke the next morning, I knew this was only the beginning. Jake Collins arrived early on a crisp Thursday morning, his pickup loaded with high-tech equipment that looked more like something from NASA than anything I'd ever used in my construction days. He stepped out, shook my hand firmly, and wasted no time unloading tripods, GPS base stations, laser scanners, and boxes of tools that gleamed in the sunlight. "George," he said, setting up his first station with the precision of a surgeon, "this is going to take a few weeks, but when I'm done, there won't be any doubt where your property lines really are." We started with my northern boundary, the one Victoria claimed was cutting into HOA green space. Jake positioned his GPS unit, calibrating it with satellite signals and county benchmarks. I stood beside him as he pulled up the data on his tablet, numbers streaming across the screen like code in a spy movie. After a long moment, he turned to me with raised eyebrows. "You're not crazy. Your fence is exactly where it should be, down to the inch." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But then he frowned, zooming out on the map overlay. "But that's not all. Your deed describes a lot line that extends 35 feet further east than your fence, which means," he turned, pointing directly toward Victoria's property, "her pool deck. That's sitting on your land." The words sank into me like ice water. My modest little fence, the one they accused of trespassing, had actually left a chunk of my rightful land unused. And that unused strip was now home to a six-figure infinity pool, marble patio, and half her tennis court. Jake didn't stop there. Over the next several days, he worked methodically, mapping every boundary, every corner, every overlap. The more he uncovered, the worse it got for the HOA. On the west side, Nathan Cross's four-car garage and circular driveway sat almost entirely on my acreage. To the south, Elena Foster's sprawling master suite with its floor-to-ceiling windows and spa-like bathroom jutted 20 feet over my deeded land. Jackson Murphy's outdoor kitchen and pizza oven mine. Even Bethany Wells's manicured front lawn and decorative fountain were planted in soil that legally belonged to me. Each discovery made my pulse race faster. What started as a petty harassment fine had transformed into something monumental. $5 million homeowners had built their dream estates on stolen ground. Martha stopped by nearly every day to check on progress. She'd bring sandwiches or sweet tea, but mostly she came to watch history unfold. I knew something was fishy back then, she muttered one afternoon, watching Jake pull another iron stake from beneath a bed of Victoria's imported roses. Those crews were out at night, moving markers around. I thought it was just part of the job. But now, this proves it. They buried the truth, literally. Her testimony alone could crush the HOA's defense, but Jake's data was the real nail in the coffin. He documented everything with photos, GPS coordinates, and signed reports. Each page a dagger pointed at Victoria's empire. One evening, after Jake packed up for the day, I walked my property line slowly, the orange survey flags fluttering in the breeze. I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of triumph and dread. On one hand, I'd been right all along my land was mine, and no HOA could rewrite history. On the other hand, I knew revealing this would unleash a storm like nothing I'd ever faced. These weren't just nosy neighbors. These were wealthy, powerful people with reputations to protect and lawyers on retainer. Sure enough, the storm came quickly. Victoria herself marched across my driveway the following morning, heels clacking like gunfire. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Miller," she snapped, "we've received reports that you've hired an unapproved contractor to perform unauthorized surveying activities on HOA land. This is a direct violation of community policy." I almost laughed in her face. "Unauthorized? You mean on my property?" I asked, gesturing to the flags Jake had left. She sneered. "That land belongs to Silver Creek Estates. Our survey proves it." "Your survey," I said calmly, pulling a copy of my father's deed from my back pocket, "was filed by a company that shut down years before it was supposedly conducted. Jake's equipment doesn't lie, and neither does this deed." Her expression faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly, smoothing her designer blazer. "If you continue down this path, Mr. Miller, you'll be facing far more than fines. You'll be bankrupting yourself in court. I strongly suggest you reconsider before you embarrass yourself further." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed back to her mansion, her two board members trailing behind like loyal soldiers. I stood there, heart pounding, watching her disappear. She thought threats could scare me. Maybe they would have scared someone else, but not me. Not anymore. That night, Jake stopped by with the preliminary results. He laid out the maps across my kitchen table, the red lines slashing boldly across the fancy properties. "George, this isn't just a boundary dispute. This is a scandal. Whoever filed that 2012 survey forged signatures and falsified coordinates. This was deliberate. And if you take this to court, you're going to own half this neighborhood." I stared at the maps, my pulse racing. For the first time, I realized the full weight of what was happening. This wasn't about me paying a fine or defending a fence. This was about exposing a fraud that reached into the heart of the HOA, the developers, maybe even the county office that approved those building permits. And the deeper I looked, the clearer it became the HOA hadn't just overstepped their bounds. They had built their entire empire on stolen soil. The days following Jake's revelations felt like walking across a minefield, every step echoing with the weight of what I knew. I had proof that Victoria and her board were living large on stolen land, but instead of backing down, they doubled their assault. The harassment came swift, calculated, and relentless. The first strike landed in the form of a noise complaint. At 6 in the morning, the county inspector showed up at my door holding a clipboard. "We've had a report of livestock disturbing the peace," he said flatly, pointing to my rooster crowing in the yard. I nearly laughed. My rooster, Bobby, had been greeting the sun for 15 years, and nobody had complained once until now. The next day, another letter arrived, this one from the city zoning office. Unauthorized agricultural use of residential land. It read, citing my chicken coop as a violation. The irony was so thick I could choke on it. These same neighbors hosted noisy pool parties until 2 a.m. Yet suddenly my hens were a menace to society. By week's end, I received a notice from the health department. Someone had reported unsanitary conditions on my property because I composted kitchen scraps. The inspector found nothing wrong, of course, but the pattern was obvious. Victoria was weaponizing every government agency she could think of, hoping to bury me under paperwork until I surrendered. I kept every letter, filed every complaint, and documented every visit. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd build a case so airtight that not even the slickest attorney could wiggle through. But the HOA wasn't finished. A week later, Victoria herself returned, not with threats this time, but with a smile that made my skin crawl. She stood on my porch in a tailored suit, holding a cashier's check like it was a golden ticket. "George," she said sweetly, though her voice carried the sharpness of a blade, "let's resolve this neighbor to neighbor. $50,000. You drop this nonsense, sign a release, and we can all move forward peacefully." I stared at that check, the numbers glittering under the afternoon sun. $50,000 was more money than I'd seen at once in my life. But compared to the land they'd stolen, compared to the principle of what was happening, it was an insult. I met her eyes, steady as a steel beam. "Mrs. Langford, I don't take money from thieves. If anyone's paying, it'll be you paying me rent for 15 years of trespassing." Her smile froze, then cracked. She stuffed the check back into her folder and left without another word. That night, as I sat on the porch staring at the horizon, Martha joined me with 2 mugs of coffee. "She's scared," she said quietly. "She wouldn't be offering money otherwise." "Scared people do stupid things," I muttered, sipping the bitter brew. "And I think she's just getting started." Sure enough, within days, an announcement arrived in everyone's mailbox. Emergency HOA meeting, mandatory attendance. Martha, who had her ear to the neighborhood grapevine, told me the plan. Victoria intended to paint me as a deranged old man, disruptive and dangerous, undermining the harmony of Silver Creek Estates. The board was preparing a presentation with photos of my so-called violations, hoping to sway the community against me. It was a clever move. If she could isolate me, make me the villain, public opinion might crush me before the truth ever saw daylight. But I wasn't about to walk into their trap unprepared. Jake and I spent the weekend assembling our own presentation high-resolution drone images, GPS overlays, photographs of the unearthed survey stakes, and copies of my deed. We organized everything into a digital slideshow that would leave no room for doubt. On Sunday evening, Daniel Brooks, my old lawyer friend, stopped by with another ally, Rachel Morgan, a sharp-tongued property attorney with 20 years of courtroom experience. "If this goes to trial," Daniel said, "you'll need someone like Rachel. She doesn't flinch in front of judges or bullies." Rachel studied Jake's maps with a frown that slowly turned into a smile. "This isn't a dispute," she said finally. "This is fraud on a scale I haven't seen in years. If you're willing to fight, George, I'll make sure the law is on your side." I shook her hand, feeling a surge of strength. For the first time, I realized I wasn't fighting alone. The day of the emergency meeting arrived, and tension buzzed through the neighborhood like electricity before a storm. The community center parking lot overflowed with cars. People whispered in clusters, some throwing me sympathetic glances, others sneering as if I were already guilty. Inside, the board sat at a long table, elevated like judges in a tribunal. Victoria presided at the center, flanked by her loyal allies. Behind them, a massive projector displayed blown-up photos of my garden, my shed, my fence labeled in bold red letters, "Violations." The room hushed as Victoria rose. Her speech dripped with false concern. She spoke of community standards, of one man's stubborn refusal to respect boundaries, of property values at risk because of my defiance. By the time she finished, several heads were nodding in agreement. Then she called my name. "Mr. Miller, you may present your defense." I stood slowly, feeling every eye on me. My knees ached, my hands trembled, but my voice was steady. I connected Jake's laptop to the projector, and the first image appeared a drone shot of the entire neighborhood. GPS-verified lines slicing boldly across the screen. Gasps rippled through the room as the red boundaries cut straight through pools, garages, and gardens, exposing the truth in bright, undeniable color. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying across the silent hall. "I've been a surveyor for 45 years. Tonight, I'm going to show you the difference between accusations and measurements, between lies and facts." As I advanced the slides, each revelation hit harder than the last. Victoria's infinity pool, built entirely on my land. Nathan's garage, mine. Elena's bedroom suite, mine. Jackson's outdoor kitchen and Bethany's front lawn, mine. The room exploded into murmurs, some in shock, others in outrage. I could see Victoria's face blanch, her mask of control cracking under the weight of evidence. And then I delivered the final blow, side-by-side images of the 2012 survey and the forged signatures. "This," I said, pointing, "is the document your HOA used to fine me, filed by a company that ceased to exist 4 years before it was dated. A forgery, a fraud." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw fear flicker in Victoria's eyes. She opened her mouth to object, but no sound came out. The truth was too heavy, too undeniable. And as the board scrambled, as neighbors argued among themselves, I realized something: the tide had turned. The HOA had picked the wrong man to bully. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was the beginning of a war they could not win. The emergency HOA meeting was supposed to be my execution. That much was obvious the moment I walked into the Silver Creek Community Center. The room had been arranged like a courtroom drama board, members lined up at a long table facing the audience, their backs to a massive projector screen. Victoria sat in the middle, draped in a designer suit so sharp it could cut glass, with 2 lawyers flanking her like bodyguards. The atmosphere hummed with anticipation. Neighbors filled every seat, some standing in the back, eager to witness the downfall of the old man who dared to defy the HOA. But the downfall wasn't mine. Not tonight. Victoria opened with her usual venom disguised as professionalism. She clicked through glossy slides showing my shed, my chicken coop, my fence, each one stamped with the word "violation" in bold red. She spoke of community standards, property values, and disruptive behavior. Her tone dripped with condescension, portraying me as a confused relic refusing to adapt to modern order. The crowd nodded along, some whispering in agreement, others avoiding my eyes. By the time she finished, you could almost taste the smugness radiating from her side of the room. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly, my knees stiff but my resolve sharper than ever. Jake set up his laptop on the projector, and the first drone image appeared, an overhead shot of the entire neighborhood. Thick red GPS-verified lines sliced across the screen, carving through pristine lawns and luxury additions like a scalpel. The audience gasped audibly, the sound swelling like a wave. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice steady though my hands trembled slightly. "I've spent 45 years as a surveyor. Tonight, I'm not here to argue feelings or opinions. I'm here to show you facts, measurements, records, and evidence that speak louder than any accusation." I clicked to the next slide. Victoria's infinity pool glistened in the image, overlaid with bright boundary lines proving it lay entirely on my land. A murmur of shock rippled through the audience. The following slide exposed Nathan Cross's prized 4-car garage and circular driveway, likewise intruding deep into my property. Gasps turned to whispers as Elena's lavish master suite, Jackson's outdoor kitchen, and Bethany's front lawn all appeared in turn, each one a glaring example of how the HOA board had been living large on soil that wasn't theirs. Victoria's composure faltered. Her hands twitched against her clipboard, lips pressed tight. One of her lawyers leaned close, whispering furiously, but the damage was done. "And here," I said, moving to the final slide, "is the survey they've been using against me. Dated 2012, filed by a company that shut down in 2008. I zoomed in on the forged signatures, side by side with the state database showing no such licensed surveyor existed. This isn't a survey, it's a forgery. A fraud designed to make my land disappear on paper, so the board could build their playground on it." The silence was suffocating. Even the hum of the projector seemed louder than the stunned crowd. Then, from the back row, Martha stood. "I remember," she said loudly, her voice trembling but strong. "When those houses were built, I saw workers moving the old stakes. They told us they were just updating boundaries for development. I thought it was legal, but I see now it was theft." Her words shattered the room. Several longtime residents nodded, some speaking up with their own memories of suspicious construction activity. Others turned on the board, whispering accusations of deceit. The tide had shifted in real time, and Victoria knew it. She tried to fight back, rising to her feet with forced indignation. "This man is misleading you. GPS surveys can't be trusted. These are fabricated accusations meant to destroy the integrity of our community." But before she could finish, Jake calmly stood and held up his license. "I am a state-certified surveyor with 30 years of experience. My credentials are verifiable, my equipment calibrated, my findings confirmed against historical deeds. You can deny opinions. Mrs. Langford, you can't deny math." A smattering of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing bolder. Victoria's face drained of color as she realized the meeting had slipped beyond her control. Nathan leaned toward her, whispering angrily. Elena shuffled papers with shaking hands. Jackson avoided eye contact altogether. Bethany sat frozen, lips pressed in a thin line, as though she just realized the fountain in her front yard might bankrupt her. I closed my presentation with the simplest of words. For decades, I've cared for this land. I never wanted conflict, never wanted attention. But when someone tries to steal what's yours, you fight back. And I will fight, in court if necessary, until justice is done. The room erupted some clapping, some shouting, some storming out in anger. Lines were drawn that night, half the neighborhood rallying behind me, the other half circling the wagons around Victoria and her board. As the meeting descended into chaos, I quietly packed up my equipment. I didn't need to gloat. The truth was now out in the open, and no amount of bluster could stuff it back in. Outside, under the cool night air, Martha clutched my arm. "You did it. George," she whispered. "They're finished." I wasn't so sure. People like Victoria didn't accept defeat easily. She'd fight with every dollar, every connection, every trick in the book. And as I looked back at the glowing mansion windows across the hill, I knew this was far from over. The real war hadn't even started. Because exposing the truth in a community meeting was one thing, winning in a court of law against millionaires with bottomless pockets would be another battle entirely. The fallout from the HOA meeting hit harder than I expected. By sunrise the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Some folks came by to pat me on the back, calling me brave for standing up to Victoria. Others turned their heads when I walked by, whispering that I was ruining the community and destroying property values. It felt like living in two different worlds, at once half allies, half enemies, and every one of them a neighbor I'd known for years. But what I feared most arrived in the form of a letter stamped with the seal of the county courthouse. Victoria hadn't wasted a moment. She'd filed a lawsuit accusing me of fraud, harassment, elder abuse, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The words leapt off the page like poison. They weren't just trying to bankrupt me, they were trying to brand me as some kind of bitter, senile menace. That same afternoon, I drove into town to meet Rachel Morgan, the property attorney Daniel had introduced me to. Her office was lined with thick law books and framed verdicts from cases she'd won. She flipped through the HOA's complaint, snorted, and tossed it on her desk. "This," she said sharply, "isn't a legal claim. It's a smear campaign dressed up in legalese. Don't panic. George, if they want war, we'll give them one." Rachel explained that the first step was filing a counterclaim. We weren't just going to defend my land, we were going to go after the HOA for fraud, trespass, and damages for 15 years of illegal use. Hearing her speak with such confidence was like a gust of fresh air. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like the playing field had leveled. Jake Collins joined us in the office that evening, dropping a thick binder of survey data onto Rachel's desk. "Every inch of this is bulletproof," he said. "Satellite confirmations, coordinate overlays, photographic evidence, and chain of title analysis from your original deed forward. I've seen sloppy cases before. This isn't one. This is a smoking gun." Rachel leafed through the binder, her smile widening with each page. "If this holds up in court, and it will, Victoria's empire is built on sand, and sand crumbles fast." Still, the weeks that followed tested me in ways I never imagined. Every day brought new paperwork, depositions, interrogatories, requests for records. Rachel warned me the HOA's lawyers would try to drown me in costs and delays, hoping I'd cave. And she was right. By month 2, I'd already spent tens of thousands in legal fees, more money than I'd ever laid out since my wife's hospital bills. To make matters worse, the harassment from the HOA escalated. Victoria filed noise complaints whenever my rooster crowed, even though sunrise was hardly a crime. She called code enforcement on my vegetable garden, claiming it attracted pests. At one point, she even accused me of running an illegal farm business because I sold eggs to a few neighbors. It was harassment by 1,000 cuts, each one designed to bleed me dry. But I wasn't about to back down. One night, as I sat at my kitchen table buried in paperwork, Martha knocked on my door with her notebook in hand. "I've been keeping track," she said proudly. She flipped it open to reveal pages of notes every time she saw a board member sneaking into Victoria's house, every shady conversation overheard, every suspicious visit from inspectors. "They're desperate, George. They know they're cornered." Her dedication nearly brought me to tears. I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The story spread beyond Silver Creek. A local news crew caught wind of the dispute, framing it as a David versus Goliath saga, a retired surveyor standing against a powerful HOA. Before long, property rights groups reached out, offering advice, sometimes even small donations to help with legal costs. What started as a neighborhood squabble was snowballing into a statewide spectacle. The HOA tried to counter the publicity with their own narrative, painting me as an unstable old man out for revenge. Their attorneys spoke to the press about protecting the integrity of the community and resisting frivolous claims. But the evidence Jake had uncovered didn't care about narratives. Numbers don't lie, and numbers were on my side. By month 4, settlement offers started rolling in. First $50,000, then $100,000, eventually $200,000 for me to drop the case and sign away any claim to the encroached land. Each time, Rachel slid the papers across her desk to me with raised eyebrows. Each time, I pushed them back. "George," she said finally, "most people would have taken this money and run. Are you sure you want to keep pushing?" I looked her square in the eyes. "I'm not here for a payday. I'm here because they stole what was mine. And if I give in now, they'll just do it to someone else." Her expression softened. "Then we fight to the end." By month 6, the case had exploded into a full-blown legal war. Both sides filed motion after motion arguments about whether GPS data was admissible, whether Jake's qualifications were sufficient, whether my 1971 deed carried more weight than the HOA's bylaws. It was like watching lawyers play chess with my life as the prize. But the support I received kept me standing. The State Surveyor Association filed a brief supporting Jake's methods, calling GPS surveying the gold standard of modern boundary determination. Property rights advocates rallied, warning that if HOAs could override deeds with fraudulent surveys, no homeowner in America was safe. The pressure on Victoria and her allies mounted. Behind closed doors, they bickered. Rumors swirled about some board members blaming her for dragging them into disaster. But Victoria herself never wavered, at least not in public. She still strutted into hearings with her $1,000 suits and cold smiles, still spat venom at me across the table. Yet I could see the cracks forming. Her empire wasn't just shaking, it was starting to crumble. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rachel called me with news. Trial's been scheduled. 8 months from now, jury trial. They're giving us plenty of time, which means this case is big. George, this could set precedent across the state. I hung up the phone, staring out across my land, the land my father once tilled with his bare hands. 8 months of battle still lay ahead, with costs, stress, and no guarantees. But I felt no fear. What I felt was resolve. They thought they could intimidate me into surrender. But all they had done was awaken the fight of my life, and I intended to win. The morning of the trial felt like walking into a storm you could see coming from miles away but couldn't avoid. The county courthouse loomed against the gray sky, its steps crowded with reporters, cameramen, and protesters carrying signs. Some signs read, "Property rights are sacred," while others parroted the HOA's narrative, "Stop the nuisance old man." The air buzzed with tension, and for a moment I almost wished I could crawl back into bed and let the world tear itself apart without me. But that wasn't an option. Not anymore. Inside the courtroom, the scene was surreal. Rows of spectators filled the benches, many from outside Silver Creek, who had followed the case through news reports. Property rights activists sat beside curious citizens, their faces intent, waiting for the battle to unfold. At the front, Judge Catherine Wu presided, her black robe as commanding as her reputation. She was known for slicing through theatrics and drilling down to facts. If anyone could see through Victoria's manipulation, it was her. On my side, Rachel Morgan looked sharp and unflappable, her case files neatly stacked. Jake Collins seated behind her with his GPS equipment ready for demonstration. Martha had come too, a quiet presence of support, sitting where I could see her smile every time I turned around. Across the aisle, Victoria sat with her legal dream team, 3 attorneys in tailored suits, their briefcases gleaming like weapons. She wore her defiance like armor, chin raised, lips curled in a faint smirk. But I saw the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted to the jury box. She was nervous, though she'd never admit it. The trial opened with the HOA's attorneys delivering their narrative. They painted me as a bitter old man clinging to outdated deeds and trying to claw wealth from my successful neighbors. They claimed GPS surveying was unreliable, that boundaries evolve over time with community use, and that my so-called evidence was a vindictive fabrication. Their expert witness, a surveyor for hire, testified that satellite positioning was never meant to settle property disputes and that traditional survey methods should prevail. The jury listened politely, but I caught the doubt flickering across their faces. Something about the argument didn't sit right, and Rachel was ready to drive that wedge deeper. When it was our turn, Rachel rose with the confidence of someone who had been sharpening her blade for months. She introduced Jake, who walked the jury through the basics of GPS surveying. He explained satellite triangulation in plain language, showing how modern instruments can pinpoint boundaries within inches far more precise than anything available when Silver Creek was built. Then he demonstrated live data, right there in the courtroom, pulling coordinates that matched the iron stakes buried under manicured lawns. The effect was electric. Jurors leaned forward, watching numbers appear on the screen, realizing they were witnessing truth in real time. You could almost feel Victoria's lawyers deflate. Rachel then presented the 2012 survey, the HOA's so-called smoking gun. Jake dismantled it like a mechanic exposing a counterfeit part. The signatures didn't match any licensed surveyors. The company had dissolved years before the survey date. The coordinates were mathematically impossible, inconsistent with county benchmarks. "This isn't just sloppy work," Jake said firmly. "It's deliberate fraud." The courtroom went silent, the weight of those words pressing on every person present. Fraud, not mistake, not oversight fraud. Then Martha took the stand. Her testimony was simple, heartfelt, and devastating. She described watching construction crews move boundary stakes during the mansion boom years, how they dismissed neighbors' questions with vague reassurances. She remembered my fence standing exactly where it was today, unchanged for decades. She had no stake in the outcome, no financial gain, no personal vendetta, just the truth. And truth carries its own authority. When Rachel finally called me to testify, I felt my throat tighten. But as I faced the jury, I thought of my father, hammering those original stakes into the earth, telling me that land was a man's legacy. I explained how I had discovered the buried stakes, how the GPS aligned perfectly with my deed, and why I refused every settlement Victoria offered. This isn't about money, I said plainly. It's about the principle that property lines don't change because someone rich decides they want more space. If they can steal from me, they can steal from anyone. The words weren't rehearsed. They came from my gut, raw and unpolished, but I saw something shift in the jurors' eyes. They believed me. Victoria's turn on the stand was a disaster. Under Rachel's cross-examination, her polished facade cracked. She couldn't explain who commissioned the 2012 survey or why the HOA had never verified it. She stammered when asked if she knew the company was defunct. When pressed about offering me cash to settle quietly, she tried to spin it as neighborly goodwill, but the jury wasn't buying it. Her arrogance, once her greatest weapon, had become her undoing. For 2 weeks, testimony, exhibits, and arguments stacked up. By the end, the courtroom was drowning in evidence maps, deeds, photographs, GPS overlays, and sworn statements. The HOA's case looked like a paper house standing against a hurricane. When closing arguments came, Rachel stood tall before the jury. This case is about more than George Miller. It's about every homeowner who's ever been told by powerful neighbors that their rights don't matter. It's about truth versus manipulation, facts versus fraud. The law protects deeds, not arrogance. And the evidence leaves no room for doubt. George's land was stolen, and the thieves wear suits. Her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The jury deliberated for 2 long days. Those hours dragged like years. Every phone ring, every knock at the door made my stomach lurch. Then, finally, we were called back. Judge Wu read the verdict in her measured voice, but the moment the words left her lips, my world changed. The jury finds in favor of George Miller. The disputed property is confirmed to be within his legal ownership as described by the 1971 deed. The HOA is liable for damages and unauthorized use. The courtroom erupted. Supporters cheered. Reporters scrambled. Cameras flashed. I sat frozen in my chair, tears stinging my eyes. Against all odds, I had won. Victoria's face drained of all color. Her attorneys already whispering about appeals. But the damage was done. The fraud was exposed. The truth upheld. And for the first time in months, I could breathe without the weight of dread crushing my chest. Walking out of that courthouse, the sky seemed brighter, the air lighter. I wasn't just George Miller, the old man with a rooster and a tomato garden. I was the man who stood his ground and proved that even against wealth and intimidation, the truth could prevail. But victory came with a price, and the aftermath would prove just as complicated as the battle itself. Victory in the courtroom should have felt like the end of the war. But as I soon discovered, it was only the beginning of a new life, one where my role shifted from embattled homeowner to reluctant landlord of millionaires. The judge's ruling was clear. The HOA board members and their families had built luxury additions pools, garages, master suites, fountains on land that legally belonged to me. They were given a choice. Either remove the structures at their own expense or pay me monthly rent for the use of my property. It was a ruling that balanced justice with practicality, but it left those who once sneered at me with no good options. The first rental check arrived in the mail 2 weeks later. I'll never forget opening the envelope and seeing Victoria's elegant handwriting on a payment made out to me for the privilege of keeping her infinity pool on my land. It was only a fraction of the cost of demolishing and rebuilding, but the symbolism hit harder than the dollars. The same woman who had once waved her manicured hand and called my deeds irrelevant now wrote my name carefully on every check, a reminder that the ground under her castle wasn't hers at all. Nathan Cross, the garage man, wasn't much better. He grumbled endlessly about being robbed while cutting me a check every month to keep parking his imported cars on my soil. Elena Foster paid the highest rent of them all for her sprawling master suite, though she negotiated fiercely, unwilling to accept that her dream bathroom now had a landlord. Jackson Murphy, who had mocked my rooster during the HOA meeting, now handed over nearly $2,000 a month just to host his wine and pizza gatherings. Bethany Wells, yes, on the other hand, surprised me. Instead of fighting, she hired a landscaping crew to move her fountain and gazebo back onto her own lot. Then, with a measure of grace the others lacked, she signed a modest lease for the sliver of front yard that remained on my side. I respected her for that. The money was more than I had ever seen in my retirement. Checks totaling over $8,000 landed in my account every month. I could have used the windfall selfishly, bought a new truck, traveled, or built myself a palace to rival theirs, but that had never been my way. Instead, I paid off debts, repaired my aging house, and established a scholarship fund for students studying surveying and construction at the local college. If my father's land was going to change lives, it would be for people who worked hard, not for those who tried to steal what wasn't theirs. Still, the shift in power reshaped Silver Creek in ways no one expected. Suddenly, I wasn't the outcast anymore. Neighbors who once treated me like a cranky relic now approached with respect, even deference. Some came seeking advice about their own property lines, worried that what had happened with the fraudulent 2012 survey might repeat itself. Jake and I conducted community workshops, teaching homeowners how to read deeds and spot red flags in surveys. For the first time in decades, people in Silver Creek started questioning the HOA instead of blindly obeying it. As for Victoria, she tried to maintain her queenly composure, but the cracks were obvious. Her once loyal board members began distancing themselves. Some even resigned quietly, unwilling to keep throwing money at a sinking ship. The HOA's reputation in the county was shattered. Realtors whispered about the Silver Creek case, and property values trembled under the weight of scandal. For Victoria, the humiliation was worse than the financial blow. She had lost her crown, and everyone knew it. Yet life wasn't all triumph and satisfaction. Victory came with shadows. The stress of the trial had taken a toll on my health. My doctor warned me to ease up before I drove myself into the grave. Some neighbors still glared at me, blaming me for dragging the community's name through the mud. And, though the rent money flowed, I carried the heavy responsibility of maintaining agreements with people who despised me but couldn't live without access to my land. But I had no regrets. None. 1 year later, I stood at the edge of my property line, rooster crowing, garden thriving, and flags from Jake's latest annual survey fluttering proudly in the breeze. My land was no longer just soil and wood and grass. It was a symbol, a reminder that truth still mattered, that power didn't always belong to the wealthiest voice in the room. Looking back, I realized something the HOA had tried to erase me, to bury my legacy beneath paperwork and intimidation. Instead, they had handed me the greatest vindication I could imagine. My father's stakes still stood, my wife's gazebo still offered shade, and now, every month, the very people who mocked me contributed to a scholarship fund in my family's name. Sometimes justice doesn't come easy. Sometimes it costs sleepless nights, thousands of dollars, and endless battles. But when it does come, when the gavel falls and the truth rings out clear, it's worth every scar. And if you ask me whether I'd do it all again, the harassment, the lawsuits, the trial, the answer is simple yes. Because no one has the right to steal your land, your history, or your dignity. And sometimes the quiet old man with a fence and a tomato garden turns out to be the toughest opponent of all. If there's one lesson my battle with the HOA taught me, it's this: never underestimate the value of what you've been entrusted with, and never let anyone bully you into surrendering what is rightfully yours. Land, home, and legacy aren't just numbers on a deed, they carry the weight of family history, sweat, and sacrifice. Wealth and intimidation may seem powerful, but truth, backed by persistence and courage, is stronger still. Too many people give up when faced with legal jargon or powerful opponents, but justice belongs to those who stand firm. My fight proved that age isn't weakness. It can be wisdom sharpened into a weapon. So if you're watching this, I want you to remember your voice matters, your rights matter, And you are never too small to push back against giants. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to fight for something that was yours? Did someone try to take advantage of you? Share your story below. And don't forget to subscribe for more HOA battles, shocking twists, and stories where the underdog gets the last laugh.